I stared at my phone in complete disbelief, reading the text message from my son Marcus for the third time. "Mom, the funeral is private. Elena's family doesn't want you there. Sorry, but that's how it has to be." My hands trembled as I set the phone down on my kitchen counter, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows suddenly feeling cold and harsh against my face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. After 35 years of marriage to David, and raising Marcus with all the love and sacrifice any mother could give, this was how I was being treated. Not invited to Robert's funeral. Robert, who had been like a second father to Marcus, who had welcomed our family with open arms when Marcus first started dating Elena 8 years ago. The same Robert who used to call me every Sunday just to chat about gardening and ask about my volunteer work at the community center. The story begins 2 years earlier, when life seemed so much simpler and our family bonds felt unbreakable. I'm Sophia Chen, a 58-year-old retired librarian living in the quiet Oakwood neighborhood of Riverside. My husband David and I had built a comfortable life together in our modest 2-story home, the same house where we raised Marcus and watched him grow from a curious little boy into what I thought was a thoughtful, caring man. I spent my days tending to my garden, volunteering at the Riverside Community Center where I helped teach adult literacy classes, and enjoying the peaceful rhythm of retirement that David and I had worked so hard to achieve. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we had something more valuable than money. We had each other, and we had our son Marcus, who lived just 20 minutes away in the upscale Hillcrest neighborhood with his wife Elena. Marcus worked as a financial advisor for one of Riverside's most prestigious investment firms, and Elena ran a successful interior design business that catered to the city's elite. They lived in a beautiful colonial-style home that Elena had renovated herself, complete with marble countertops, custom millwork, and a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like something out of a home and garden magazine. When Marcus first brought Elena home to meet us 6 years ago, I was immediately impressed by her sophistication and intelligence. She spoke 3 languages fluently, had traveled extensively throughout Europe, and possessed an eye for beauty that transformed everything she touched. Elena came from what she often referred to as old money, her family having built their fortune in real estate development over several generations. Her father Robert was a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, who owned several commercial properties throughout Riverside and the surrounding areas. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and had a way of making everyone around him feel valued and heard. From the moment we met, Robert treated David and me like family, often inviting us to join them for holiday celebrations and special occasions. Elena's mother, Patricia, was more reserved, always perfectly dressed and well-mannered, but there was a coolness in her interactions with us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. She never said anything directly offensive, but I noticed the way her eyes would sweep over our modest home when they visited, or how she would subtly redirect conversations when David talked about his work as a high school mathematics teacher. Despite Patricia's reserved nature, those early years felt harmonious. Marcus and Elena seemed genuinely happy together, and when they announced their engagement 3 years ago, David and I were thrilled. The wedding was an elegant affair held at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, with 200 guests and no expense spared. Elena wore her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and Marcus looked more handsome than I had ever seen him in his custom-tailored tuxedo. I remember feeling so proud as I watched my son exchange vows with the woman he loved, surrounded by both families and countless friends. Robert gave a beautiful speech about welcoming Marcus into their family, and even Patricia seemed genuinely warm as she hugged me during the reception. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For a brief moment, it felt like we were all truly one big, happy family. The first signs of trouble began subtly, almost imperceptibly, about a year after the wedding. Marcus started visiting us less frequently, often canceling Sunday dinners at the last minute because Elena had made other plans, or they had social obligations with her circle of friends. When they did visit, Elena would spend most of the time on her phone, handling work calls or scrolling through social media, while Marcus seemed increasingly distracted and distant. I began to notice changes in Marcus that concerned me. He had always been a thoughtful person who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who called just to check in and see how we were doing. But gradually those calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, the conversations felt rushed and superficial. He would ask the basic questions about our health and activities, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. The changes became more pronounced during family gatherings. Where Marcus used to help me in the kitchen and chat about his work and future plans, he now spent most of his time on his laptop, or having hushed conversations with Elena in corners of the room. When I would try to engage Elena in conversation about her business, or ask about their plans for starting a family, she would give polite but brief responses before excusing herself to take a phone call or attend to something urgent. David and I began to feel like outsiders in our own son's life. The easy intimacy we had always shared with Marcus seemed to be evaporating, replaced by a formal politeness that felt foreign and uncomfortable. When we suggested family trips or activities, there was always a reason why they couldn't participate. Elena's business was too demanding, or they had commitments with her family, or they were planning to travel to Europe with her college friends. The situation became even more strained when Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago. The diagnosis came as a shock to everyone, and initially, it seemed to bring our families closer together. Marcus and Elena spent countless hours at Robert's bedside during his treatments, and David and I did everything we could to support them during this difficult time. I organized meal deliveries for Patricia, helped coordinate Robert's medical appointments, and spent hours researching treatment options and connecting them with specialists. Robert always seemed grateful for my help, often squeezing my hand and thanking me for being such a caring part of his family. Even during his illness, he maintained his gentle, inclusive nature, always asking about my volunteer work and David's students. But as Robert's condition worsened, I noticed Elena becoming increasingly possessive of the caregiving responsibilities. She began making decisions about his care without consulting anyone else, and when I offered to help with practical matters like grocery shopping or transportation to appointments, she would politely decline, saying that her family preferred to handle things privately. Marcus, caught between his wife and his parents, began to withdraw even further. Our conversations became strained, and I could sense tension in him that he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. When I would ask how Robert was doing, or if there was anything we could do to help, Marcus would give vague, non-committal responses that left me feeling more disconnected than ever. The final months of Robert's life were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and increasingly desperate attempts to spend time with him and support our family. Elena had effectively taken control of all decisions regarding his care, and while I understood her need to be involved, I couldn't help but feel that David and I were being systematically excluded from important moments and conversations. Patricia, who had never been particularly warm toward us, became even more distant during this period. She would acknowledge our presence at family gatherings with polite nods and brief greetings, but there was an unmistakable coldness in her demeanor that made me uncomfortable. I began to suspect that she was influencing Elena's decisions about limiting our involvement in Robert's care, but I had no concrete evidence to support this feeling. Robert passed away peacefully 3 days ago, surrounded by Elena, Patricia, and Marcus. David and I had been at the Socombus hospital just hours before, but Elena had suggested we go home to rest, assuring us that there was no immediate cause for concern. We received the call about his death at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the grief I felt was compounded by the realization that we hadn't been there for his final moments. The next day, Marcus called to let us know that funeral arrangements were being made, and he would keep us informed about the details. I assumed, naturally, that we would be involved in the planning process and would attend the service to pay our respects to a man who had meant so much to our family. Robert had been more than just Elena's father to us. He had been a friend, a mentor, and someone who had welcomed us with genuine warmth and kindness. That's what made Marcus's text message this morning so devastating. The casual, almost dismissive tone of his words felt like a slap in the face. The funeral is private. Elena's family doesn't want you there. As if we weren't family. As if the years of shared holidays, celebrations, and support meant nothing. As if Robert himself hadn't considered us part of his extended family. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. David was still asleep upstairs, and I dreaded having to tell him about Marcus's message. He had grown genuinely fond of Robert over the years, and I knew this exclusion would hurt him deeply. How do you explain to your husband of 35 years that your own son doesn't consider you worthy of attending a funeral for someone you both cared about? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about a funeral. It was about respect, family bonds, and the gradual erosion of relationships that I had been trying to ignore for months. Elena and her mother had never fully accepted us as equals, and now they were using Robert's death as an opportunity to formalize that rejection. But what hurt most was that Marcus was allowing it to happen. My son, whom I had raised to be compassionate and inclusive, was now complicit in excluding his own parents from an important family event. The Marcus I knew would never have sent such a cold, impersonal text message about something so significant. He would have called, explained the situation, and tried to find a compromise that honored everyone's feelings. But this Marcus, the one who had been shaped by years of Elena's influence and her family's subtle condescension, seemed like a stranger to me. I thought about all the sacrifices David and I had made over the years to ensure Marcus had every opportunity to succeed. The countless hours I spent helping him with homework, driving him to soccer practice and music lessons, supporting him through college and graduate school. We had used our savings to help him with the down payment on his first apartment, celebrated every promotion and achievement, and welcomed Elena into our family with open arms. And this was how our love and dedication were being repaid, with a text message telling us we weren't welcome at a funeral for someone we cared about. The injustice of it all made my chest tight with emotion, and I found myself questioning whether I had somehow failed as a mother. Had I been too permissive? Too accommodating? Had I allowed Elena and her family to gradually push us aside without putting up enough resistance? As I sat there in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a lifetime spent building a loving family, I realized that something fundamental had to change. I couldn't continue to accept this treatment passively, watching as the relationships we had worked so hard to build were systematically dismantled by people who saw us as somehow inferior or unworthy of inclusion. The sound of David's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts, and I quickly wiped away the tears that had started to form in my eyes. I would have to tell him about Marcus's message, but first, I needed to figure out what we were going to do about it. Because one thing had become crystal clear to me in that moment of painful realization. I wasn't going to let them exclude us from Robert's funeral without a fight. This was about more than just attending a funeral service. This was about standing up for our dignity, our worth as human beings, and our right to be treated with the respect that any loving family members deserved. Robert would never have wanted us to be excluded from his final farewell, and I owed it to his memory and to our own self-respect to make sure that didn't happen. As David entered the kitchen and saw the expression on my face, I knew that our quiet, peaceful retirement was about to take a dramatic turn. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time in years I felt a sense of purpose and determination that surprised me with its intensity. They might think they could push us aside and treat us like second-class family members, but they were about to discover that this retired librarian had more fight in her than they had ever imagined. David took one look at my face and immediately set down his coffee mug. After 35 years of marriage, he could read my emotions better than anyone, and the mixture of hurt and anger written across my features told him everything he needed to know. "What happened?" he asked gently, pulling out the chair beside me at our small kitchen table. The morning light was streaming through our yellow gingham curtains, the same ones I had sewn myself when we first moved into this house 28 years ago. Everything about our kitchen spoke of warmth and family. The handmade ceramic bowls Marcus had crafted in high school pottery class, the collection of recipe cards passed down from my grandmother, the refrigerator covered with photos spanning decades of birthdays, holidays, and family milestones. I handed him my phone without saying a word, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to quiet fury as he read Marcus's text message. David had always been the calm one in our relationship, the steady presence who could find rational solutions to any problem. But I could see the muscle in his jaw tightening as he processed what our son had just communicated to us. "Private funeral," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they might somehow make more sense when spoken aloud. "Elena's family doesn't want us there." He set the phone down carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way they always became when he was struggling to contain his emotions. "I can't believe he would send this in a text message," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not a phone call, not a conversation. Just a cold, impersonal text, like we're acquaintances he's trying to avoid. David ran his hand through his gray hair, a gesture I had seen countless times over the years whenever he was working through a difficult problem. As a mathematics teacher, he approached most situations with logic and methodical thinking, but this was clearly something that defied rational analysis. "There has to be more to this story," he said finally. "Marcus wouldn't exclude us from Robert's funeral without a good reason. Robert loved us, Sophia. You know he did. Remember last Christmas when he pulled me aside and told me how grateful he was that Marcus had parents who raised him with such strong values?" I nodded, remembering that conversation. Robert had been sitting in our living room, admiring the handmade ornaments on our Christmas tree, when he turned to David with tears in his eyes. "You and Sophia did something right with that boy," he had said. "Elena is lucky to have found someone with such a good heart and strong character. That doesn't happen by accident. That comes from being raised by people who understand what really matters in life." The memory made the current situation even more painful. How could the same man who had spoken those words just 8 months ago now be having a funeral where we weren't welcome? It didn't make sense, and the inconsistency of it all made me question everything I thought I knew about our family dynamics. "I'm going to call him," David said, reaching for the phone. "This is ridiculous. We need to have a real conversation about what's going on." But when David dialed Marcus's number, the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again 15 minutes later with the same result. By the third attempt, it was clear that Marcus was deliberately avoiding our calls, which only confirmed my growing suspicion that there was much more happening beneath the surface than we had realized. Over the next few hours, I found myself replaying every interaction we'd had with Elena and her family over the past year, searching for clues that might explain this sudden exclusion. The signs had been there, subtle but consistent, and I began to realize how naive I had been to dismiss them as mere personality differences or cultural misunderstandings. There was the incident at Marcus's birthday dinner 6 months ago, when Patricia had made a pointed comment about different social circles while discussing vacation plans. At the time, I had interpreted it as a general observation, but now I wondered if it had been a deliberate slight aimed at highlighting the economic disparities between our families. Then there was the conversation I had overheard between Elena and one of her friends at a family barbecue last summer. They were talking about wedding planning for the friend's daughter, and Elena had mentioned something about managing expectations when it came to certain family members who might not understand the level of sophistication required for high-end social events. When she noticed me approaching, she had quickly changed the subject, but the dismissive tone in her voice had stuck with me for weeks. I remembered feeling uncomfortable during several holiday gatherings where Elena would make subtle corrections to stories I was telling, or where she would redirect conversations away from topics related to David's teaching career or my volunteer work. At the time, I had attributed these moments to her desire to keep conversations light and social, but now I wondered if they were actually attempts to minimize our presence and contributions to family discussions. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Elena had been systematically undermining our relationship with Marcus for years. It wasn't through dramatic confrontations or obvious manipulation, but through a steady erosion of respect and inclusion that had been so gradual I hadn't recognized it until now. David spent the afternoon trying to reach Marcus through various channels, calling his office, sending emails, even reaching out to some of Marcus's old friends who might have current contact information. But every attempt was met with silence or deflection, and by evening it became clear that our son was not going to explain his decision or engage in any kind of meaningful dialogue about the situation. "This isn't like him," David said as we sat on our back porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Our garden was in full bloom, the result of countless hours I had spent nurturing the roses, lavender, and jasmine that now filled the air with their sweet fragrance. This had always been our sanctuary, the place where we came to talk through problems and find peace in each other's company. "Maybe it is like him now," I replied, voicing the fear that had been growing in my mind all day. "Maybe this is who Marcus has become, and we just didn't want to see it." The thought was almost too painful to accept. The Marcus the First had raised would never treat his parents with such callous disregard, but that Marcus had been gradually disappearing over the past few years, replaced by someone who seemed to value social status and material success above family loyalty and basic human decency. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept fitfully beside me. My mind kept circling back to Robert and the conversations we had shared over the years. He had been such a kind, genuine person who seemed to appreciate our family's warmth and authenticity. I couldn't reconcile the man I knew with the idea that he would have wanted us excluded from his funeral. The next morning brought another shock that confirmed my worst suspicions about what was really happening. I was checking my email when I found a message from my friend Janet, who worked as a receptionist at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home. The subject line read, "Saw the notice about Robert's service," and my heart began racing before I even opened the message. "Hi, Sophia," Janet had written. "I saw that Robert Patterson's funeral is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. at St. Mary's. I was surprised to see that it's listed as a public service, not private, like you mentioned yesterday when we talked about you not being able to attend. I thought you might want to know in case there was some confusion about the arrangements. Let me know if you need any other information. Love, Janet." I stared at the email in disbelief, reading it 3 times to make sure I understood what Janet was telling me. The funeral wasn't private at all. It was open to the public, which meant anyone who wanted to pay their respects to Robert could attend. Marcus had lied to us. The exclusion wasn't based on the family's desire for a private, intimate service. It was a deliberate decision to bar David and me specifically from attending. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Our son had looked us in the eye, or at least sent us a text message, and deliberately deceived us about the nature of Robert's funeral service. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a difficult family decision that he was reluctantly communicating. This was an intentional lie designed to keep us away from an event where we had every right to be present. I called David at the high school where he was covering some end-of-semester administrative duties, and I could hear the pain in his voice when I explained what Janet had discovered. "So anyone in Riverside can attend Robert's funeral except for us," he said quietly. "Random strangers who barely knew him can pay their respects, but his son-in-law's parents are specifically banned from being there." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Robert had always treated us with such warmth and respect, and now we were being prevented from honoring his memory by the very people who should have been welcoming our support and shared grief. It felt like a betrayal not just by Marcus and Elena, but of everything Robert had represented as a kind, inclusive person who valued relationships over social hierarchies. But Janet's email had also given me something I hadn't expected: information. If the funeral was public, then technically there was nothing stopping us from attending, despite Marcus's lies. The question was whether we should assert our right to be there, knowing it would likely create a confrontation that could permanently damage our relationship with our son. I spent the rest of the day wrestling with that decision, weighing our desire to honor Robert's memory against the potential consequences of defying Marcus and Elena's wishes. Part of me wanted to show up at St. Mary's on Thursday afternoon and let them deal with the awkwardness of their deception being exposed. But another part of me worried that such a confrontation would only drive Marcus further away and give Elena additional ammunition to use against us in future family conflicts. David came home that evening with a grim determination I hadn't seen in years. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said, as we sat down to a dinner neither of us had much appetite for. "And I keep coming back to the same question. What would Robert want?" It was a good question, and one that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Robert had always been someone who brought people together rather than driving them apart. He had made it clear on numerous occasions that he considered us family, and I couldn't imagine him approving of our exclusion from his funeral service. "He would want us there," I said with growing conviction. "He would want anyone who cared about him to have the opportunity to say goodbye and celebrate his life. That's the kind of person he was." David nodded slowly. "Then I think we should go. Not to cause drama or make a scene, but to honor a man who meant something to us and who always treated us with respect and kindness." It was a risky decision, one that could have far-reaching consequences for our family relationships. But sitting there in our kitchen, surrounded by the memories and mementos of a lifetime spent building loving connections with others, I realized that some things were more important than avoiding conflict. our integrity, our right to grieve for someone we cared about, and our refusal to be treated as second-class family members were all worth fighting for. The next day, I called Janet back and asked her to provide me with all the details about Robert's funeral service. She gave me the time, location, and even mentioned that there would be a reception afterward at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where Marcus and Elena had held their wedding reception 3 years earlier. As I wrote down the information, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination that reminded me of how I had felt years ago when I was advocating for better resources at the community center where I volunteered. Sometimes you had to be willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable or potentially confrontational. But even as I made plans to attend Robert's funeral, I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was about much more than just one day or one event. The lies, the exclusion, and the complete lack of communication from Marcus all pointed to deeper problems in our family that had been festering for years without being addressed. I began to see a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. There were the missed family dinners, the canceled holiday visits, the gradual reduction in phone calls and personal conversations. There were the times when Marcus had seemed uncomfortable with Elena's dismissive comments about our lifestyle or values, but had never actually spoken up to defend us or address her behavior. Looking back, I could see that Marcus had been slowly allowing Elena and her family to reshape his priorities and loyalties, trading the authentic relationships he had been raised to value for acceptance into a social circle that measured worth by wealth and status, rather than character and kindness. The process had been so gradual that neither David nor I had recognized it until it reached this crisis point. The funeral exclusion wasn't really about Robert or funeral arrangements. It was about power and control, about Patricia and Elena's desire to formalize the social hierarchy they had been constructing for years. By preventing us from attending, they were sending a clear message about who belonged in their family and who didn't, who was worthy of respect and inclusion, and who could be discarded when convenient. And Marcus, rather than standing up for the values he had been raised with or defending the parents who had loved and supported him unconditionally, had chosen to go along with their cruel manipulations. That realization was perhaps the most painful part of this entire situation. Not just that he was excluding us, but that he was doing so in service of people who had systematically undermined our family relationships for their own petty social purposes. As Thursday morning approached, I found myself thinking not just about Robert's funeral, but about what would happen afterward. Even if David and I attended the service and successfully paid our respects to Robert, the underlying problems in our family would still exist. Marcus would still be married to Elena, Patricia would still consider us beneath her social standing, and our son would still be faced with choosing between his parents and his wife's family. The funeral would be a test of our willingness to stand up for ourselves, but it would also be the beginning of a longer struggle to reclaim our son and rebuild the family relationships that had been so carefully undermined over the past few years. I wasn't sure we could win that battle, but I was becoming increasingly certain that we had to try. Robert deserved to have people who loved him at his funeral, and David and I deserved to be treated with basic respect and dignity by our own family members. If attending his service meant forcing a confrontation that had been years in the making, then perhaps it was time for that confrontation to happen. The stakes were higher than just one afternoon at St. Mary's Church. This was about who we were as people, what we stood for as a family, and whether we were willing to fight for the relationships and values that had always been most important to us. As I laid out my black dress for Robert's funeral, I realized that I was preparing for much more than just a memorial service. I was preparing for a battle to reclaim our family's soul. Thursday morning dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the weight I felt in my chest as I prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging days of my life. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother, the same one I had worn to every important family event for the past 20 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now wearing it to attend a funeral where my own family didn't want me present. David emerged from the bathroom straightening his navy tie with the same careful precision he brought to everything in his life. We had barely spoken during breakfast, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what we were about to do. The decision to attend Robert's funeral, despite Marcus's lies, had seemed clear and necessary. when we made it 2 days ago. But now, in the cold light of morning, the potential consequences felt overwhelming. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" David asked quietly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Once we walk through those church doors, there's no going back. This is going to change everything between us and Marcus, probably permanently." I took a deep breath, considering his question one final time. The safe choice would be to stay home, to accept Marcus's deception and exclusion as the price of maintaining what remained of our relationship with him. We could pretend to believe his lies about the funeral being private, swallow our hurt and dignity, and hope that somehow things would improve over time. But deep in my heart, I knew that choosing the safe path would only embolden Elena and Patricia to treat us with even greater disrespect in the future. "Robert deserves to have us there," I said finally, my voice stronger than I felt, "and we deserve the right to say goodbye to someone who meant so much to us. If Marcus and Elena want to exclude us from their lives, they're going to have to do it honestly, not through lies and deception." David nodded slowly, and I could see the same mixture of determination and apprehension in his eyes that I felt in my own heart. We were both educators, people who had spent our careers believing in the power of honest communication and principled stands. Neither of us was comfortable with confrontation, but we had reached a point where avoiding conflict meant abandoning our core values. As we drove through Riverside toward St. Mary's Church, I found myself thinking about all the conversations I had shared with Robert over the years. He had been genuinely interested in my volunteer work at the community center, often asking detailed questions about the literacy programs I helped coordinate and the adult learners I worked with. Unlike Patricia, who seemed to view my volunteer activities as quaint hobbies that filled my retirement time, Robert understood that helping others learn to read was meaningful work that made a real difference in people's lives. I remembered the afternoon last spring when Robert had asked me to help him write a letter to the city council advocating for increased funding for adult education programs. He had heard me talking about some of the challenges our learners faced, and he wanted to use his influence as a respected businessman to support the cause. We spent 2 hours at my kitchen table, crafting a letter that ultimately helped secure additional resources for the program. "You have a gift for explaining complex issues in ways that make people care," he had told me as we finished the letter. "Marcus is lucky to have a mother who understands how to make the world a better place." Those words had meant more to me than any expensive gift or fancy dinner, because they came from someone who recognized the value of service and compassion. Now, as we approached the church where Robert's funeral was being held, I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if Patricia had shared her husband's values. Robert had always treated people with kindness regardless of their social status or economic circumstances, but Patricia seemed to measure everyone's worth by their wealth, connections, and social standing. The parking lot at St. Mary's was already nearly full when we arrived, which confirmed what Janet had told me about the service being public rather than private. I recognized several cars belonging to people from Robert's business circle, as well as vehicles I associated with various community organizations he had supported over the years. The sight of so many attendees made Marcus's lie about the funeral being private even more hurtful and absurd. As we walked toward the church entrance, I spotted Marcus's silver BMW parked near the front of the lot, in a space that had probably been reserved for immediate family members. The sight of his car made my heart race with a mixture of nervousness and anger. In just a few minutes, we would be face to face with our son for the first time since receiving his deceptive text message, and I had no idea how he would react to our presence. David took my hand as we approached the church steps, a gesture of solidarity that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him 37 years ago. Throughout our marriage, he had always been my anchor in times of uncertainty, the steady presence who helped me find courage when I needed it most. Today would test both of us in ways we had never experienced before, but at least we would face that test together. The interior of St. Mary's was beautifully decorated with white lilies and roses, flowers that Robert had always loved in his own garden. Soft organ music filled the sanctuary, and the warm light filtering through the stained glass windows created an atmosphere of peace and reverence that seemed perfectly suited to honoring Robert's gentle spirit. For a moment, I forgot about the family drama and focused on the real reason we were there, to say goodbye to a man who had enriched our lives with his kindness and wisdom. We chose seats about halfway back on the left side of the church, close enough to see the front pews where the immediate family would be sitting, but far enough back to avoid creating an immediate confrontation. I could see Patricia in the front row, dressed in an elegant black dress that probably cost more than David's monthly salary. She was surrounded by what appeared to be her extended family and close friends, all of whom looked like they belonged to the same exclusive social circle. Elena was sitting beside her mother, looking composed and dignified in a way that reminded me of a magazine photograph. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her black designer suit was tailored to fit her slim figure flawlessly. Even in grief, she managed to project an image of sophisticated elegance that I knew I could never match, no matter how carefully I dressed or prepared for an occasion. Marcus was on Elena's other side, and the sight of him made my chest tighten with a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and hurt. He looked older than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and fatigue. His dark suit was impeccable, as always, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was carrying a heavy burden. I wondered if some part of him felt guilty about lying to us and excluding us from this important day. The service began with a welcome from Father Martinez, who had known Robert for over 20 years through his involvement in various church activities. As the priest spoke about Robert's generosity, his commitment to helping others, and his deep love for his family, I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes. This was the Robert I had known and cared about, the man who had treated David and me like cherished family members, rather than inconvenient obligations. During the opening hymn, I noticed Marcus turning slightly in his seat, as if he sensed our presence but wasn't quite sure where we were sitting. When his eyes finally found us, the expression that crossed his face was one of shock, followed quickly by what looked like panic. He leaned over to whisper something to Elena, who immediately turned to look in our direction. The cold fury in her eyes was unmistakable, even from across the crowded sanctuary. I watched as Elena whispered something to Patricia, who also turned to locate us in the congregation. The older woman's face remained composed, but I could see her jaw tighten in a way that reminded me of a predator preparing to strike. It was clear that our presence was not just unwelcome, but was being viewed as some kind of aggressive provocation, rather than a simple desire to pay our respects to Robert. Throughout the service, I tried to focus on the beautiful tributes being shared about Robert's life and contributions to the community. His business partner spoke about his integrity and fairness in all their dealings. A representative from the Literacy Foundation, where Robert had served on the board, talked about his passionate commitment to education and his belief that everyone deserved the opportunity to learn and grow. A longtime neighbor shared memories of Robert's kindness and his willingness to help anyone who needed assistance. But even as I listened to these moving testimonials, I couldn't ignore the tension radiating from the front pews where Marcus, Elena, and Patricia were sitting. I could see Marcus checking his phone repeatedly, probably texting someone about our unexpected presence. Elena kept glancing back at us with poorly concealed hostility, and Patricia maintained the rigid posture of someone who was furious but determined not to show it publicly. The most poignant moment of the service came when Father Martinez invited anyone who wished to share a memory of Robert to come forward and speak. Several people took advantage of this opportunity, sharing touching stories about Robert's generosity, wisdom, and humor. I found myself wishing I could stand up and tell the congregation about the afternoon Robert had spent helping me write that letter to the city council, or about the countless conversations we had shared about books, gardening, and life in general. But I knew that any attempt to participate in the service would be seen as a deliberate provocation by Elena and Patricia, and I didn't want to create a scene that would detract from the dignity of Robert's memorial. So I remained in my seat, letting others share their memories while I held my own recollections of Robert close to my heart. As the service drew to a close, Father Martinez announced that there would be a reception following the burial at Grandview Cemetery, and that everyone was welcome to join the family at the Riverside Country Club afterward for refreshments and continued fellowship. The irony of that invitation wasn't lost on me, given that Marcus had specifically told us we weren't welcome at any part of Robert's funeral or memorial activities. The congregation began to file out of the church, with the immediate family exiting first through a side door that led directly to the waiting limousines. I watched as Marcus, Elena, and Patricia were escorted away by the funeral director, none of them making eye contact with David or me, despite knowing we were present. Their deliberate avoidance felt like another slap in the face, a clear message that even at Robert's funeral, they had no intention of acknowledging our existence or our right to be there. As we walked slowly toward the church exit, I noticed several people I recognized from various community events over the years. Many of them seemed surprised to see us, probably because they knew about our family connection to Robert, and expected us to be sitting with the immediate family rather than among the general congregation. A few people approached us to offer condolences and share brief memories of Robert, treating us with the warmth and respect that his own family had denied us. "Robert always spoke so fondly of you and David," said Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had worked with Robert on several charity committees. "He was so proud of Marcus for having such wonderful parents, and he often mentioned how much he enjoyed your visits and conversations. I'm sure he would be happy to know you're here today." Her words were both comforting and heartbreaking, because they confirmed what I had always believed about Robert's feelings toward our family. The man being buried today had genuinely cared about us, and had considered us part of his extended family. The exclusion and hostility we were experiencing came entirely from Patricia, Elena, and sadly, our own son Marcus. The graveside service at Grandview Cemetery was mercifully brief, conducted under gray skies that threatened rain at any moment. David and I stood at the back of the group gathered around Robert's casket, maintaining a respectful distance while still being present for this final farewell. I could see Marcus, Elena, and Patricia near the front, standing with their arms linked in a show of family solidarity that pointedly excluded us. As Father Martinez offered the final prayers and Robert's casket was lowered into the ground, I felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond just grief for Robert's death. I was also mourning the death of our family as I had known it, the loss of the close relationship David and I had once shared with our son, and the end of our innocent belief that love and good intentions were enough to hold a family together. After the burial, most of the attendees began making their way back to their cars for the drive to the Riverside Country Club reception. David and I had originally planned to attend the reception as well, since Father Martinez had specifically announced that everyone was welcome. But as I watched Marcus, Elena, and Patricia being escorted to their limousine by the funeral director, I realized that showing up at the country club would be pushing our luck too far. We had accomplished what we came to do by attending the funeral service and graveside ceremony. We had honored Robert's memory, asserted our right to be present for his final farewell, and demonstrated that we wouldn't be intimidated by lies and exclusion. Attending the reception would likely trigger the kind of ugly confrontation that could permanently damage any hope of reconciling with Marcus in the future. "Should we go to the reception?" David asked quietly as we walked back toward our car. We were invited along with everyone else. I considered his question carefully, weighing our desire to fully participate in Robert's memorial activities against the potential consequences of pushing this confrontation further than we already had. The reception would be held in a more intimate setting where our presence would be impossible to ignore, and I suspected that Elena and Patricia had probably already made arrangements to have us removed if we dared to show up. "I think we've made our point," I said finally. "We came to honor Robert, and we've done that. Going to the reception would just be looking for trouble, and I don't want Robert's Memorial Day to be remembered for the family drama we caused." As we drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I felt emotionally drained but also strangely empowered. For the first time in years, David and I had taken a stand for our own dignity and worth, refusing to be treated as disposable family members who could be excluded and dismissed at will. The consequences of that stand were still unknown, but at least we had acted with integrity and courage. That evening, as we sat on our back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, David reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of us," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, at least we didn't let them intimidate us into staying away from Robert's funeral. He would have wanted us there, and we honored that." I squeezed his hand in response, feeling grateful for his steady support throughout this difficult day. We had taken the first step in what I suspected would be a long and challenging process of redefining our relationship with Marcus and his wife's family. There would undoubtedly be consequences for our decision to attend the funeral, despite being told we weren't welcome. But we would face those consequences together, with our dignity and principles intact. The phone remained silent that evening, despite my half-expectation that Marcus might call to confront us about our presence at his father-in-law's funeral. His continued silence felt like another form of rejection, a clear signal that he had no intention of explaining his behavior or attempting to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few short days. The illusion of family harmony that I had been desperately trying to maintain had been shattered completely, replaced by a clear-eyed understanding of how Marcus, Elena, and Patricia really viewed David and me. We were not cherished family members whose presence enriched their lives. We were inconvenient reminders of a social class they preferred to distance themselves from. But that painful realization had also freed us from the exhausting effort of trying to win acceptance from people who had never respected us in the first place. We no longer had to pretend that Elena's subtle insults were just personality quirks, or that Marcus's increasing distance was simply the natural result of his busy career. We could finally acknowledge the truth of our situation and decide how we wanted to respond to it. The funeral had been just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to define who we were and what we stood for as a family. I wasn't sure what Marcus's response would be to our defiance of his wishes, but I was certain that whatever came next, David and I would face it with our heads held high and our consciences clear. We had honored Robert's memory in the way he would have wanted, by refusing to let social pretensions and petty exclusions diminish the love and respect we felt for him. And in doing so, we had also honored ourselves and the values that had always guided our lives. Whatever the cost of that decision might be, it was a price I was willing to pay. The silence that followed our attendance at Robert's funeral was deafening. For 3 days, our phone remained eerily quiet, with no word from Marcus, Elena, or anyone else in their circle. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, waiting for the inevitable explosion of anger that I knew would come. David tried to maintain his usual routines, grading papers and preparing lesson plans for his substitute teaching assignments, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he startled every time the phone rang. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Robert's death, the confrontation finally arrived. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses and trying to find some peace in the familiar rhythm of tending to growing things, when I heard David calling my name from inside the house. The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench with dread. "Sophia, you need to come in here," he said through the screen door. "Marcus is here, and he's not alone." I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and hurried inside, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Through our front window, I could see Marcus's silver BMW parked in our driveway, with Elena's white Lexus right behind it. They had come together, which meant this wasn't going to be a casual family visit or an attempt at reconciliation. This was a coordinated assault. I barely had time to remove my gardening gloves before the doorbell rang, followed immediately by sharp, insistent knocking. David and I exchanged a look of mutual support before he opened the door to reveal Marcus and Elena standing on our front porch. Both of them were dressed as if they had come directly from some upscale social event, their expensive clothes and perfect grooming, a stark contrast to my gardening attire and David's casual weekend clothes. "We need to talk," Marcus said without any greeting or preamble. His voice was cold and controlled, but I could see fury burning in his eyes. Elena stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed and her expression radiating the kind of icy disdain that I had become all too familiar with over the years. "Of course," David said, stepping aside to let them in. "Please come in and sit down." But Marcus didn't move toward our living room. Instead, he remained standing in our small entryway, his posture rigid and confrontational. "I think we'll have this conversation right here," he said. "This won't take long." The deliberate slight stung. Our home, which had always been a place of warmth and welcome for Marcus throughout his childhood and young adulthood, was now apparently not worthy of a proper visit. Elena's subtle nod of approval at his rudeness confirmed that this dismissive attitude had been planned in advance. "How could you do that to us?" Marcus began, his voice rising with each word. "How could you show up at Robert's funeral after I specifically told you that you weren't welcome? Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to have my parents crash a private family event?" "The funeral wasn't private, Marcus," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the hurt and anger churning in my chest. "It was open to the public." Anyone who wanted to pay their respects to Robert could attend. That's not the point, Elena interjected, speaking for the first time since they had arrived. You knew you weren't wanted there. You knew this was a difficult time for my family, and you chose to make it about yourselves instead of respecting our wishes. The accusation was so unfair and so completely divorced from reality that I felt momentarily speechless. We had attended Robert's funeral specifically to honor his memory and say goodbye to someone who had meant a great deal to us. The idea that our presence was somehow selfish or attention-seeking was both hurtful and absurd. We went to honor Robert, David said, his teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with unreasonable behavior. He was important to us, and we had every right to be there. The fact that you lied to us about the funeral being private doesn't change that. Marcus's face flushed red at the accusation of lying, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he doubled down on his anger. You had no right to be there after I told you not to come. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes Elena's family uncomfortable with you. You don't respect boundaries, you don't understand social situations, and you always have to make everything about yourselves. The words hit me like physical blows, each accusation more painful than the last. This was my son, the child I had raised with love and care, reducing our presence at a public funeral to some kind of narcissistic attention-seeking behavior. The Marcus I had known would never have spoken to his parents with such cruelty and disrespect. What boundaries? I asked, my voice beginning to shake with emotion. When did wanting to say goodbye to Robert become crossing a boundary? When did caring about someone who treated us like family become inappropriate behavior? Robert wasn't your family, Elena said sharply. He was my father, and his funeral was about our grief, not your need to insert yourselves into situations where you don't belong. The coldness in her voice was breathtaking. This was the same woman who had sat at our dinner table countless times, who had accepted our gifts and hospitality, who had smiled and nodded when Robert spoke fondly about his extended family that included David and me. Now she was rewriting history to erase our connection to Robert and minimize our legitimate grief at his passing. Robert considered us family, David said firmly. He told us so on numerous occasions. He valued our friendship and our relationship with Marcus. I find it hard to believe he would have wanted us excluded from his funeral. Well, Robert isn't here to speak for himself, is he? Marcus said with a harshness that made me flinch. And the people who are responsible for making decisions about his funeral arrangements decided that your presence wasn't appropriate. I stared at my son in shock, trying to reconcile this cold, cruel stranger with the compassionate young man I had raised. When had he become someone who could speak about Robert's death with such casual callousness? When had he learned to use other people's grief as a weapon to hurt his own parents? Marcus, what happened to you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. When did you become someone who lies to his parents and treats them with such contempt? This isn't who you were raised to be. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes that looked like uncertainty or even shame. But Elena's hand on his arm seemed to strengthen his resolve, and his expression hardened again. I grew up, Mom, he said. I learned that sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to protect the people you love. Elena and her family needed space to grieve, without having to worry about managing your feelings or dealing with your need for attention. The accusation was so unfair and so completely wrong that I felt my own anger finally beginning to surface. For years, I had swallowed Elena's subtle insults and Marcus's increasing distance, telling myself that maintaining family harmony was more important than defending myself. But there were limits to what I could accept, and my son standing in my home accusing me of attention-seeking behavior at a funeral had crossed every possible line. Attention-seeking? I repeated, my voice growing stronger. Is that what you think we were doing? Your father and I attended a public funeral service to honor a man who had been kind to us for years. We sat quietly in the back, we didn't make a scene, and we left before the reception to avoid causing any confrontation. How exactly was that seeking attention? You knew your presence would upset Elena's family, Marcus said. You knew it would create drama and make an already difficult day even harder for them. But you went anyway because you always have to have your way, no matter who gets hurt. I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes, both from hurt and from frustration at the impossible situation Marcus was creating. He was using our love for him as a weapon against us, twisting our desire to be included in important family events into some kind of selfish manipulation. "We went because we loved Robert," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "We went because he had been good to us and we wanted to say goodbye. If that hurt Elena's family, then maybe they need to examine why the presence of two people who cared about Robert was so threatening to them." Elena stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you dare question my family's grief or their right to control who was welcome at my father's funeral. You have no idea what we've been going through or how inappropriate your behavior has been." "Then explain it to us," David said, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension. "Help us understand why two people who cared about Robert and had a relationship with him for 6 years weren't welcome at his public funeral service." Elena and Marcus exchanged a look that spoke volumes about the coordinated nature of this confrontation. It was clear that they had discussed their strategy in advance and had prepared their talking points to present a united front against us. "It's not about Robert," Elena said finally. "It's about respect and understanding your place in our family. My mother has never felt comfortable with the way you insert yourselves into situations and try to take over. She was trying to protect her own family's privacy during a difficult time." The mask was finally coming off, and the truth was being revealed in all its ugly glory. This wasn't about funeral arrangements or grief management. This was about Patricia's class consciousness and her desire to exclude people she considered beneath her social status. Elena was simply carrying out her mother's wishes, and Marcus was enabling both of them. "Take over?" I repeated incredulously. "When have we ever tried to take over anything? We've been nothing but supportive and respectful toward your family from the day Marcus brought you home." "You don't see it because you don't understand social dynamics," Elena said, with the kind of condescending tone that made my skin crawl. "You don't realize how your behavior comes across to people who are used to more sophisticated social interactions." The insult was delivered so smoothly that it took me a moment to fully process what she had just said. She was essentially calling David and me unsophisticated rubes who didn't know how to behave in polite society. The years of subtle put-downs and backhanded compliments were now being replaced with direct attacks on our character and social standing. "What exactly have we done that's so unsophisticated?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Please, enlighten us about our social failures." Elena seemed surprised by the directness of his challenge, as if she had expected us to simply accept her criticism without defending ourselves. She glanced at Marcus for support, but he seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "It's not any one thing," she said, clearly struggling to come up with specific examples. "It's more about understanding boundaries and knowing when your presence is appropriate versus when it's intrusive." "Like attending a public funeral for someone who considered us family?" I asked. "That was intrusive?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly, apparently deciding to support his wife despite his obvious discomfort. "It was intrusive because I specifically told you not to come. When someone tells you that your presence isn't wanted at a family event, the appropriate response is to respect that decision, not to find ways around it." I stared at my son, trying to understand how he had become someone who could speak to his parents with such casual cruelty. The Marcus first had raised would never have excluded people from a funeral, and he certainly would never have lied about the nature of the service to ensure that exclusion. "So this is how it's going to be from now on?" I asked, my voice heavy with sadness. "You're going to decide which family events we're worthy of attending, and if we don't accept your decisions without question, we're being intrusive and inappropriate?" "This is about more than one funeral," Elena interjected. "This is about establishing healthy boundaries and making sure everyone understands their role in our family structure." The phrase family structure made my blood run cold. It implied a hierarchy where David and I were being relegated to some lower status, where our feelings and relationships didn't matter as much as those of Elena's family. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to our exclusion from Robert's funeral in the first place. "What role do you see us playing in this family structure?" David asked with deceptive calm. "Are we still Marcus's parents, or have we been demoted to something less important?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment I thought he might actually engage, with the fundamental question David was asking. But Elena's presence seemed to stiffen his resolve, and he fell back on the same defensive talking points they had been using throughout this confrontation. "You're still my parents," he said, "but that doesn't give you the right to ignore boundaries or make demands about how Elena's family handles their private affairs." "A public funeral isn't a private affair," I pointed out, "and wanting to say goodbye to someone we cared about isn't making demands." "You're missing the point," Elena said with obvious frustration. "This isn't about Robert or the funeral specifically. This is about your pattern of behavior and your inability to respect other people's wishes when they conflict with what you want." I felt my temper finally beginning to fray at the edges. After years of trying to accommodate Elena's preferences and overlooking her subtle insults, after accepting Marcus's increasing distance and making excuses for his behavior, I was being accused of being demanding and disrespectful. The injustice of it was overwhelming. "What pattern of behavior?" I asked, my voice rising. "What demands have we made?" "We've bent over backward to accommodate your schedules and preferences. We've accepted being excluded from holidays and family events. We've watched you pull Marcus away from us without complaint. What more do you want from us?" "We want you to understand that things have changed," Marcus said. "I'm married now, and my primary loyalty is to my wife and her family. That means sometimes you're not going to be the priority you used to be." The words were delivered like a final verdict, and they hit me with the force of a physical blow. My son was essentially telling me that David and I had been permanently demoted in his life, that our relationship with him would now be subject to Elena's approval and Patricia's social preferences. "So that's it then," David said quietly. "After 30 years of being your parents, after supporting you through college and graduate school, after welcoming Elena into our family and trying to build relationships with her parents, we're now just an inconvenience to be managed." Marcus at least had the grace to look uncomfortable at that summary, but he didn't deny it. Elena, however, seemed pleased that they had finally stated their position so clearly. "It's not about being an inconvenience," she said. "It's about everyone understanding their place and respecting appropriate boundaries. If you can do that, we can have a perfectly pleasant relationship." The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. She was essentially offering us the opportunity to remain in their lives, as long as we accepted a subordinate role and never challenged their decisions or preferences. We could be tolerated as long as we knew our place. I looked at my son, searching his face for any sign of the compassionate, principled young man I had raised, but all I saw was someone who had been completely captured by Elena's worldview. Someone who was willing to sacrifice his relationship with his parents to maintain his standing in his wife's social circle. "I think you both need to leave now," I said quietly. "This conversation isn't accomplishing anything except causing more hurt." "Fine," Elena said, clearly relieved to end what had become an uncomfortable confrontation for her. "But I hope you'll think about what we've said. There's still a chance for us to have a good relationship if you're willing to be reasonable." As they turned to leave, Marcus paused at the door and looked back at us. For just a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the son I remembered, someone who might be having second thoughts about the cruel things that had been said. But then Elena took his arm, and the moment passed. "Goodbye, Mom, Dad," he said formally, as if we were acquaintances he was unlikely to see again soon. After they left, David and I stood in our entryway in stunned silence. The confrontation we had been dreading for days was finally over, but instead of providing any kind of resolution, it had only made the situation worse. The things that had been said couldn't be unsaid, and the lines that had been drawn couldn't be erased. I sank into my favorite armchair, feeling emotionally drained and older than my 58 years. The family I had worked so hard to build and maintain had been systematically destroyed, not by some external crisis or tragedy, but by the cruel selfishness of people who should have valued our love and support above their social pretensions. David sat down across from me, his face reflecting the same exhaustion and heartbreak I felt. "I never thought I'd see the day when our own son would speak to us like that," he said quietly. "It's like he's become a completely different person." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The Marcus who had just left our house was indeed a different person from the son we had raised. Elena and her family had systematically reshaped his values and priorities, turning him into someone who could exclude his parents from a funeral and then blame them for being hurt by that exclusion. The worst part was the realization that this confrontation was probably just the beginning. Elena had made it clear that our continued relationship with Marcus would depend on our willingness to accept a subordinate role and never challenge their decisions. We would be allowed to remain in their lives as long as we knew our place and didn't cause any inconvenience. That evening, as we sat on our back porch watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, I realized that we were facing a choice that would define the rest of our lives. We could accept Elena's terms and try to maintain whatever relationship with Marcus was possible under her conditions. Or we could refuse to be treated as second-class family members and risk losing our son entirely. It was a choice no parent should ever have to make, but it was the choice Marcus and Elena had forced upon us. And as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the garden I had lovingly tended for decades, I began to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is your own child. 6 months passed after that devastating confrontation in our entryway, and the silence between Marcus and us stretched on like an endless winter. David and I had fallen into new routines that didn't include weekly phone calls from our son or impromptu family dinners. The absence of Marcus's presence in our lives was a constant ache, like mourning someone who was still alive but had chosen to become a stranger. I threw myself into my volunteer work at the community center with renewed passion, spending extra hours helping adult learners navigate their journey toward literacy. There was something deeply satisfying about working with people who genuinely appreciated guidance and support, a stark contrast to the rejection I had experienced from my own family. David picked up additional substitute teaching assignments, finding comfort in the classroom environment where his knowledge and experience were valued. Our friends and neighbors who had known Marcus since he was a child would occasionally ask about him with the innocent expectation that families naturally stayed connected. I learned to deflect those questions with vague responses about everyone being busy, unwilling to expose the painful truth of our estrangement to people who couldn't possibly understand how a loving family could fragment so completely. Then, on a crisp October morning, everything changed. I was preparing lesson materials for my afternoon literacy class when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and for a moment I stared at it in disbelief. After 6 months of complete silence, my son was finally reaching out. "Hello, Marcus," I said carefully, unsure of what tone to strike after so much time had passed. "Mom." His voice sounded different somehow, strained and uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager facing a difficult situation. "I need to talk to you and Dad. Could I come over?" The request was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. "Of course," I managed finally. "When would you like to come?" "Is now okay?" he asked, and I could hear something that sounded almost like desperation in his voice. "I know it's short notice, but this can't wait." An hour later, David and I sat in our living room waiting for Marcus to arrive. We had positioned ourselves in the same chairs where we used to have countless family conversations throughout his childhood and adolescence, back when our home was a place of warmth and open communication, rather than a battlefield for hurtful accusations. When Marcus knocked on the door, David and I exchanged a look of mutual apprehension before I went to answer it. Our son stood on the front porch alone this time, without Elena's intimidating presence to reinforce his resolve. He looked tired, older than his 32 years, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Thank you for letting me come," he said quietly as I stepped aside to let him in. The formal politeness in his voice was heartbreaking, a reminder of how far we had drifted from the easy intimacy we once shared. He took a seat across from us, and for a long moment nobody spoke. I studied his face, searching for clues about what had prompted this unexpected visit. There was something different about his demeanor, a vulnerability that had been completely absent during our last confrontation. "I owe you both an apology," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about that day when Elena and I came here, about the things I said to you, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved." I felt my heart beginning to race with a mixture of hope and caution. After months of hurt and rejection, the possibility of reconciliation seemed almost too good to believe. I was angry about the funeral, he continued, but more than that, I was scared. Elena had been so upset about you being there, and her mother was furious. I felt caught between my family and hers, and I handled it in the worst possible way. David leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but guarded. What's changed, Marcus? Why are you here now? Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the anxious child he had once been. Elena and I are separated, he said quietly. She moved out 3 weeks ago. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me. Part of me was genuinely sorry that his marriage had failed, despite everything that had happened between us. But another part felt a guilty sense of relief that the person who had systematically poisoned our family relationships was no longer controlling Marcus's decisions. I'm sorry to hear that, David said, and I could tell he meant it. Marriage ending is always difficult, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus nodded, his eyes focused on his hands folded in his lap. The thing is, it wasn't just the separation that made me realize what I'd done. It was something Elena said right before she left. He looked up at us for the first time since arriving, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. She told me that she had never respected you, that she had always seen you as beneath our social level, and that she was glad I had finally learned to put you in your proper place. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though they merely confirmed what I had suspected for years. Hearing Elena's true feelings articulated so bluntly, and knowing that our son had been exposed to that kind of toxic thinking throughout his marriage, made me understand just how systematically our family bonds had been undermined. She was proud of the way you excluded us from Robert's funeral, I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Marcus's face crumpled with shame. She said it was a perfect example of how I had learned to prioritize the right relationships and manage problematic family members. Those were her exact words, Mom. Problematic family members. I felt tears beginning to form in my own eyes, both from the pain of knowing how Elena truly viewed us, and from the relief of finally hearing Marcus acknowledge what had really been happening in our family. The worst part, Marcus continued, his voice breaking, was realizing that I had let her convince me you were the problem. I started seeing your love and concern as interference. I began viewing your desire to be included in family events as attention-seeking behavior. She had me so turned around that I actually believed you were being unreasonable for wanting to attend Robert's funeral. David reached over and took my hand, a gesture of support that reminded me how fortunate I was to have a partner who had remained constant throughout this ordeal. Robert loved you both, Marcus said, looking directly at me. He used to tell Elena and me all the time how lucky I was to have parents who had raised me with such strong values. He would have been horrified to know that you were excluded from his funeral, and even more horrified to know that I was the one who excluded you. The mention of Robert brought back all the grief I had been carrying, not just for his death but for the way his memorial had been corrupted by Elena's social machinations and Marcus's willingness to go along with them. Why didn't you see it at the time? I asked, genuinely trying to understand how my son had become so lost. You knew Robert cared about us. You knew we had a right to be there. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with his own question. Elena was very good at making her preferences seem reasonable, he said finally. She would present things in a way that made opposition seem selfish or inappropriate. And I wanted so badly to fit into her world, to be worthy of the life she offered, that I convinced myself her perspective was more sophisticated than yours. The admission was painful, but also illuminating. I began to understand that Marcus hadn't consciously chosen to hurt us. He had been gradually manipulated into believing that his parents' values and feelings were less important than his wife's social preferences. I lost myself, he continued. I became someone I don't recognize, someone who could lie to his parents about a funeral and then blame them for being hurt by that lie. I'm not sure I can ever forgive myself for the way I treated you. I looked at my son, seeing for the first time in years the vulnerable, caring person I had raised. The arrogance and coldness that had characterized his behavior during our last confrontation were gone, replaced by genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make amends. We're your parents, Marcus, I said softly. We love you unconditionally, even when you make mistakes that hurt us deeply. The question isn't whether we can forgive you. The question is whether you can learn from this experience and make sure it never happens again." David nodded in agreement. "What Elena did was wrong, but she couldn't have succeeded in dividing our family if you hadn't allowed it to happen. If you want to rebuild our relationship, we need to understand that you won't let anyone else manipulate you into treating us with disrespect again." Marcus met our eyes directly for the first time during his visit. "I swear to both of you that I will never let anyone come between our family again. I don't know if I can undo all the damage I've caused, but I want to try." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, stretching well into the evening as we began the difficult process of rebuilding trust and understanding. Marcus told us about the gradual way Elena had isolated him from us, how she had reframed every interaction to make us seem intrusive or inappropriate. He described the constant pressure he felt to choose sides, and how Elena's threats to leave him had made him prioritize his marriage over his relationship with us. I shared my own experience of watching him drift away, of feeling helpless as Elena's influence grew stronger and our connection grew weaker. David talked about the pain of seeing his son become someone who could speak to his parents with such cruelty, and how difficult it had been to maintain hope that the real Marcus was still there somewhere. As the evening wore on, I began to see glimpses of the son I remembered. His laugh, which had been missing from our interactions for years, returned as we shared memories of happier times. His genuine interest in our lives and activities, which had been replaced by polite but distant inquiries, reasserted itself, as he asked detailed questions about my volunteer work and David's teaching experiences. But I also remained cautious, knowing that rebuilding our relationship would take time and consistent effort. Marcus would have to prove through his actions, not just his words, that he had truly learned from this painful experience. Over the following months, Marcus made good on his promise to repair our family bonds. He began calling regularly again, not just to check in, but to have real conversations about our lives and his own struggles with divorce and starting over. He started joining us for Sunday dinners, something that hadn't happened in over 2 years. Most importantly, he began making decisions that prioritized our relationship rather than external social pressures. When Patricia attempted to maintain contact with him after his separation from Elena, he politely but firmly declined her invitations, explaining that he needed to focus on rebuilding relationships with people who had always loved him unconditionally. The divorce proceedings were difficult and sometimes contentious, with Elena attempting to claim assets and support that Marcus felt were unreasonable. But throughout that stressful period, he never once suggested that we should avoid discussing the situation, or that our opinions weren't welcome. Instead, he sought our advice and support, treating us like the family we had always been rather than inconvenient outsiders to be managed. One evening in late spring, almost a year after that first reconciliation conversation, Marcus brought us to Robert's grave to pay our respects together. We stood quietly beside the headstone, and Marcus offered a heartfelt apology to Robert's memory for the way he had dishonored his funeral by excluding people who loved him. "He would forgive you," I said, watching as Marcus placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave. Robert understood that people sometimes make mistakes when they're under pressure. What would matter to him is that you learned from the experience and chose to do better. As we walked back to our cars that evening, Marcus stopped and turned to face David and me. "I know I can never completely undo the hurt I caused," he said. "But I want you both to know that losing Elena was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it helped me remember who I really am and what truly matters in life." 6 months later, Marcus met Sarah, a kindergarten teacher who shared his values and appreciated the importance of family relationships. When he brought her to meet us, I was struck by the difference in his demeanor compared to how he had been with Elena. He was relaxed, genuinely happy, and eager for us to get to know the woman who had captured his heart. Sarah was warm, unpretentious, and genuinely interested in getting to know us as people, rather than evaluating our social status. She asked thoughtful questions about our volunteer work and teaching experiences, and she laughed at David's terrible jokes with the same genuine amusement that had always endeared him to people who valued character over sophistication. When Marcus and Sarah announced their engagement 2 years later, they insisted that David and I be intimately involved in planning the wedding. Unlike the elaborate country club affair that had marked Marcus's first marriage, this celebration was held in our church with a reception in the fellowship hall. It was simple, heartfelt, and focused on bringing together people who genuinely cared about the couple, rather than impressing anyone with displays of wealth or status. As I watched Marcus exchange vows with Sarah, I thought about the journey our family had taken to reach this point. The pain of those years when Elena's influence had poisoned our relationships seemed like a distant nightmare compared to the joy and connection we now shared. Marcus had learned the hard way that authentic relationships built on love and mutual respect were infinitely more valuable than social connections based on superficial appearances and materialistic values. The experience had changed all of us in profound ways. I had learned to stand up for my own worth and dignity, even when doing so meant risking relationships I desperately wanted to preserve. David had discovered reserves of strength and patience he hadn't known he possessed. And Marcus had gained wisdom about the difference between people who love you for who you are and people who only value you for what you can provide or represent. Today, our family is stronger than it has ever been, built on a foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and hard-won wisdom about what truly matters in life. We still gather for Sunday dinners, but now they include Sarah and the grandchildren who call me Grandma Sophia and climb onto David's lap to hear stories about his teaching adventures. Sometimes I think about Elena and Patricia, wondering if they ever reflect on the damage their social pretensions caused to a loving family. But mostly, I focus on the future we're building together, grateful for the painful lessons that ultimately made us all better people and brought us closer together than we had ever been before. The text message that started this whole ordeal, "The funeral is private, his wife's family doesn't want you there," now seems like a blessing in disguise. It forced us to confront problems that had been festering for years, and ultimately led to a stronger, more authentic family bond based on truth, rather than the careful avoidance of difficult conversations. Looking back, I realize that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even from people you love deeply. By standing up for our dignity and attending Robert's funeral despite being told we weren't welcome, David and I set boundaries that ultimately helped our son remember his own values and choose a path that led back to us. Our family's story serves as a reminder that love alone isn't always enough to maintain healthy relationships. Sometimes you have to fight for those relationships, stand up for what's right, and refuse to let toxic influences destroy the bonds that matter most. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is showing them through your own example what it looks like to live with integrity and self-respect, even when doing so comes at a significant cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.